You got it.
Got
It's all your show.
Okay.
Now, do you want me to ask you questions, or do you want to just start talking?
No, the questions help to key it in the direction you want to go.
Okay. Well, then let's start with where you came from. like,
Well, there's Papa and Mama.
yeah. Let's start with your papa and mama, and where they came from,
Okay.
and that'll be the easiest. I gotta get cleaner.
There's some in the
So-
bathroom there.
Yeah, there's some right here. So let's start with Papa and Mama and decide. You can, first of all, Grandma Tate's name was Newbold. She was English. Was she full English?
Grandpa was English.
What was Grandma?
She was English also. A great, 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 great granddaughter of Miles Standish.
Oh, I remember that. Yeah.
Shall I get the sheet?
What was that, Priscilla?
And he, John Alden, Miles Standish asked John Alden to speak for him.
Speak for thyself.
And he went to Priscilla and said, asked her if she would be considered Miles Standish, and she said, speak for yourself, John. As a consequence, I didn't get Priscilla as one of my ancestors. Nor did you.
No. Where, Miles Standish, how many generations back was that, do you know?
I'd have to count them.
Probably 10 generations back. There wasn't a whole lot of Miles Standish in the...
No, he was the only one that came over with the
Pilgrims?
other the Pilgrims, yeah.
Yeah.
See, he was the guard in charge of the military approach of the Pilgrims to America. He was his job.
That's right.
And I got my history.
That's right. So, there's English on that side.
Yeah.
And the other side of the family?
Dad's folks came from Scotland. 5 brothers at one time, as the story goes. And they were crofters. Had to move out of Scotland because of the wool the price of wool had gone up, and the milling had come into business. That is, the commercial weaving had come in, and the people that owned the landlords, the dukes and earls that owned the land, wanted all of it. They didn't want these crofters plowing up part of it and planting it and all the rest of it. Huh?
What's a crofter?
They were there and shared their production with the owner, with the landowner.
Like sharecroppers.
They were like sharecroppers, yeah.
Only called crofters, C-R-O-F-T-E-R-S.
Mm-hmm. And the result was that they tore down the houses that they lived in and told them to get the heck out. They couldn't stay there because they wanted to grow sheep, to have sheep, and that was the reason they had to get out. And so these came from America, the 4 brothers, and they had very little education, and on the way over they got in a fight amongst themselves how they were going to spell their name. And 2 of them spelled it T-A-T-E, and 3 of them spelled it T-A-I-T.
Now, which was the original spelling?
Well, nobody knows.
You don't, huh?
No, there's no way of...
You'd have to go back to Scotland, I suppose, and find out...
But the rest of the story was that when I was over there in France on that tour with us, I my name was Tate. And they said, oh yeah, that is Chief. Tate. His head.
Now that goes back a long way.
Oh yeah, that puts...
Yeah.
So they were French Huguenots that came from France, where they were just chased out when the Napoleon was in the flux there.
So a lot of Scotsmen were originally Frenchmen.
Mhm. More fun, more babies stepped on.
So the Tate side was Scotch.
Yeah.
What was your father's mother?
I don't know.
Did you ever know her?
No. She was in Alabama and I was here.
So your dad was born in Alabama.
Raised there. And his dad was had a big plantation, grew cotton, also made a lot of pine tar and turpentine from the pine forests on his place.
Is that why so many blacks are named Tate? Is
Yeah,
that why so many blacks are named Tate?
That's part of
from
it.
the plantation that
Yeah.
that he owned?
He had 40 slaves.
What part of Alabama? Do you know?
Yeah, the middle part, just north of Mobile there. Maybe 100 miles north of Mobile.
Did you ever venture into that area to find
Yeah.
out about it?
Yeah. I was curious to know why Dad chose these places he did up there in the Sierras.
Yeah, I'm curious too.
Well, that was the reason. He kept going along until he found rolling hills, nicely wooded, with a stream on it. And that was the kind of a place he was raised on. There was some vacant land, and so he proceeded to choose that. And he could have chose over there near where Jackson is, where what's called over there?
Alice?
Huh?
Alice? Over in Sonora?
Well, no, Sonora's in the wrong direction. Jackson is over in Amador County, which
Yeah.
is north, towards Sacramento. But he worked over there for two or 3 months running a blacksmith shop there because they were wanting a blacksmith so badly. And he looked around all that territory. Here there was miles and miles of open land there he could have had, which was open, government land. He could have filed on and wouldn't have had to cut any trees down to have something to plow. This place we had to cut down and ruin timber there, burn trees this big to get land to come up with a government demand for so many acres of
Arable land. How much land did he homestead?
160 to start with. And then the land was so poor that he had heard that the other parts of the country where they had this poor land had gotten a grant from the government to have extended acreage for livestock pasture. And so he contacted the congressman from California, Congressman Raker, I think it was, anyhow, and told him about it and got him to, wrote to him and suggested that they set up this thing in California, this 640 acres for, it's just merely pasture land, but no timber. You couldn't sell timber off of it or minerals. It was purely for the minerals, and timber would still belong to the government for so many years. And the Congress passed it. By the time they got it passed, there was only another 80 acres. Maybe it was 120 acres. 120 acres next to him that was available because others come in and filed on it around him. And so he was isolated, and so he ended up with 280 acres or something like that.
So, what brought him to California? Why did he decide to leave Alabama?
Oh, he worked. He had when the war was over. Grandpa Tate became the what do you call him the bondsman. Became the bondsman for the elected county treasurer. And when the taxes were all in, the county treasurer disappeared. And so as a consequence,
Not
the bond,
Grandpa Tate.
huh?
Not Grandpa Tate.
No, Grandpa Tate then had to furnish all the money that or all he could of what the guy had absconded with. He'd gone off to South America, and so they sold the slaves. They couldn't sell the slaves because this was after the war. Grandpa had kept his slaves as employees at $1 a month per person.
How many people were there?
There was 40 odd, and he proceeded to.
But they were free men then.
They were free men,
Uh-huh.
and so they got just turned loose on the community, and
Was he
and
a,
they sold his place, and they moved into a little place in town. I forget what town it was. Anyhow, I think it seems to me like it was Lafayette, but I'm not sure. But anyhow, they didn't have room for all the kids. There was one girl went to Georgia, older girl, and 2 older boys went to Texas to go to college. There was enough, they could had some kind of a pull that they could go to college. And Dad was sent to Mississippi as an apprentice to a blacksmith, a cousin or some relation that way. And Uncle Lee was just a baby. And so he was the only one that went with the family into the small cottage or small cabin in town.
well, had they been moneyed people, and then when he had to replace all of this tax money that the assessor ran off with, his bond was his land, apparently.
Yeah, that's right.
Huh.
And so as a consequence, he had, when the Civil War came along, he proceeded to saddle up his horse and joined the Southern Army. And he rode north, and his chief steward went with him.
Well, I thought you said that was after the war.
Yeah, but just this prior.
Oh, okay.
His,
While he was still a landowner, he
Yeah.
saddled up his horse.
This was before the war was ended. And so he went to war and to fight the North. And somewhere up the line, while he was riding, a bullet come down and knocked the big toe off of his right foot.
You're kidding.
And that was his wound. And so, spoiled the boot. So he come back and stayed, got well and stayed there on the place till the war was over. The funny
Did
part.
he get a pension then for his wound?
They didn't give pensions to the Southerners.
Oh, that's
But,
right. He was a Southerner.
Yeah, he was Southern. And the funny part of it is, your grandmother, or your mother, Adelaide, her dad went as a Northern soldier, and he got a bullet through his boot, and it knocked the big toe off his left foot.
Oh my gosh.
And we've been fighting ever since. So anyway, Dad spent 5 years there in Mississippi, becoming a blacksmith, and then started becoming a journeyman up the Mississippi Valley there, and finally ended up in Denver, Colorado.
Now, had he met Grandma then?
No. So then he went to, in Denver, he met up with a group of men that were selling clay pots that were made somewhere in Ohio or Pennsylvania and being shipped out there, and they were being distributed. In other words, they would go around and
My gosh,
Take-
pot distributors.
Distribute-
Running the family.
distribute pots, or take orders, and then they'd go back a few days later and deliver them. They could plan their deliveries better that way. And so they got wore Denver out, and so they headed west, and they got to Oakland. That's as far as the train went, because couldn't cross the bay, and you'd have to take the boat. Well, they thought they'd work the east side of the San Francisco Bay out, and that was when they worked Oakland and Berkeley and San Leandro, and they got up to Hayward's, and there Dad met Alice Newbold. And she ordered a pot. He proceeded to demonstrate, which was, they had a little pot with him, and he'd give it a fling like that, and if it landed and skittered, why, of course it wouldn't break, but to see how tough it is. This was the big sale was always what a good piece of the pottery it was. You could throw it on the floor carefully and get an order. And before they got to come back to deliver, why, he suggested that they go for dinner, and she went out to dinner with him.
Now, was she a nurse?
No,
What was her occupation, or what did she do?
she had worked with her dad there in Iowa. He was a commercial seed grower. He grew seed for the commercial people and anybody else that wanted them. And this was his way of making a living, was to grow seed, and he furnished seed to people. And she helped him select the seed plants and to harvest these various seeds. There's garden seeds and grain and corn and whatnot.
Mm-hmm.
And so she worked with him, and also she worked with him with the bees. He had bees to pollinate all these various plants that he had.
I didn't know Grandma worked with bees.
And that's where Grandma learned to work with bees.
Huh,
And
I
she
didn't
loved
know that.
it.
Yeah.
And the only thing was that Grandpa didn't know anything about beekeeping, and nobody else did back there. And so very carefully to take care of them, he put them down cellar every winter. And he usually lost 9 out of 10 hives because the truth of the matter was he didn't have room enough in there for them to defecate, and as a consequence they died from being all bound up.
Mm-hmm.
And Mom didn't know that. This was one of the things that I learned after
Well, would they have died outside?
no,
I didn't think so.
they'd have been all right if they'd been outside, but
Yeah.
he was taking good care of them.
Mm-hmm.
But he still managed to save enough of them to utilize them. Well, it went along, and he got 3 boys through high school and college, and 1 girl through college, and Mom was still in high school. And
So there were 5 children in her family.
yeah, and 2 boys went to after they got their degree in medicine, they came to California. There was wide open country out here, and one, Uncle Teddy, went to Oroville, just above Sacramento, and Uncle Reuben went to Morgan Hill, just south of San Jose.
Mm-hmm.
And when they liked it, and Grandpa had rheumatism. In wintertime, he could hardly move. He'd just get bound up with his aches, pains, and so they said, come to California and try it. Well, he came out one winter, and he was sold immediately, but he didn't ache.
It was the cold that caused it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so he bought 2 acres in Haywards, and that was where Dad met her, in selling these pots.
Mm-hmm.
And she had just graduated from high school a little while, and
So, did they marry right away, or did?
no, it was a year later or something, and so Dad quit the pot before Dad talked her into going with him and selling pots, because she was at loose ends there, and so she joined the crew, and they sold pots up through the San Joaquin and Sacramento Valley, clear up to Chico, and up in there, and somewhere up there where Dad popped the question apparently, and they came back, and 6 months later they were married, and the first day of January in 1900 was their wedding day.
Oh, is that right?
And Grandpa gave them a couple $1,000s to build a house with.
That was a lot of money.
No?
That what would that be, like 20,000 today?
Yeah.
I bet you could probably almost build a house back then. I don't know.
Yeah.
Could you?
And so Dad had set up a business before they got married in Alameda. He was being a blacksmith. He went into shoeing horses, but race horses in particular. And sometimes he'd change the horse's shoes 2 and 3 times a day or a couple times a week just to get the right weight, the right angle to certain shoes on certain horses. And
Was there a racetrack in Alameda?
oh yeah, there's lots of racetracks around
Were they?
the Bay Area
Mhm.
there. And so that was that, and I come along, or no, first my sister came along.
No.
No, which told I held on to everything. The first girl name was Julia. No. Lily Bell. Lily Bell Tate. The Lily was for the Grandma Lily, which came down from the Pilgrims. That was the name that was on the Grandma Lily was my mother's maiden name. My mother's mother was Lily, and Belle was Dad's favorite sister in Alabama.
Oh, for
And
heaven's
so
sake.
it became Lily Bell. And when she was 2 months old, she got whooping cough and died.
I'd forgotten all about that.
And so that was the,
And that was how many years before you were born?
I still wasn't born until 4 years later, after they were married. In other words, I was 2 years after Lily Bell. And 3 years after that, Alice was born. But I was always ill, and Alice was part of the time.
So you were born in Hayward?
No, they had built the house in Fruitvale, which is toward downtown Oakland by about 14 miles or something to Fruitvale.
Yeah.
And they,
Does it still stand?
it was when last I knew about it. It was off the main drag, so as a consequence, it probably hasn't been demolished but although it may be in apartment houses, I don't know. But the doctors maintained that if they wanted to raise me, they'd better get out of that damp climate.
Yeah.
Because I was always down with the cold, and it went into pneumonia every time. So Dad started out looking for, one summer, he started out in the spring of 1910, and went to Stockton, and then took the stagecoach up to McElhenney Hill. Or he didn't go to McElhenney Hill, he went to Jackson. And he got into a hotel there, and they said, "What's your business?" He said, "A blacksmith." They said, "Well, the blacksmith just shot himself here last week," and he says, "To everybody around here is wanting their horses shod and the wagons fixed, and here's the shop out there. Our shop belongs to the hotel here. And if you'll go there and operate, you can have everything you make there." And so Dad went out there, and for two months shod horses and fixed wagons, and on weekend, every Sunday, he'd go out and look for land to homestead. And finally, told him, "Well, I'm not getting anywhere here, I'll have to leave you." And so he said, "Maybe I'll be back later." Give him that maybe stuff. And away he went. He crossed the McElhenney River and got into Calaveras County and rode with a mailman up to Railroad Flat, which was 26 miles. And there he started walking. And he come across this nice little valley where big pine trees grew all the way around, and the trout were in the stream, and he said, "This is it, if it's vacant." So he went to the county seat, it was vacant, and he's filed on it. And come back down to Oakland and sold his business and put the house up for rent and bought a little wagon and a white mare and loaded us kids and everything on and put it on the boat to go from Oakland to Stockton, which is an overnight trip. And by the side wheeler in Stockton, we got in the little wagon and started out for the 60-mile drive to up past Mokelumne Hill to Railroad Flat and to the within a mile of, or half mile of where the land was that he filed on.
Do you remember that trip?
Oh God, yes, every inch of it.
Well, how old were you then?
I was 7.
Oh yeah, you would remember that.
Oh yeah,
Mhm.
very tough.
Was it exciting, or were you frightened, or
No, I was interested.
just it was another adventure, huh?
Oh yeah.
How did Grandma Tate feel about it? I'm just thinking, you know, here's this lady who has a nice home, and this guy comes back and he says, "All right, we're going to sell everything and pack up and leave."
Well, but anything for us brats. This
Yeah,
is the whole thing.
anything for you to save your life.
Alice would come down with oh.
Did she have TB?
Huh?
Did she get TB?
No, I was the one.
Oh.
No, when you get so you can't breathe. What's
Asthma.
Asthma.
Yeah.
She'd come break out with asthma in the wintertime when she got, so she got up there, she never did have another stroke of asthma at all when she got up in the mountains there.
Is that right? It was that dampness down
Yeah.
there.
And I got colds and never did get a real bad pneumonia thing.
Uh-huh.
But several years after we moved into the house there, the neighbor came down and come to find out he was a TB patient, and I picked up the bug.
That was in Mokelumne Hill.
Huh?
That was at the cabin in Mokelumne Hill.
No, it was in the home cabin up there in the mountains there.
Yeah.
See, we're 26 miles from Mokelumne Hill.
What was the name of the? Was there a name?
Well, the nearest mining town was 3 miles away, and it was Railroad Flat.
Was it?
And the only railroad there was a little set of tracks that ran back into a tunnel that some miner had there, and they had a little push cart on it, and that was the railroad. That was why Railroad Flat.
Huh. But how you had to go 26 miles into Mokelumne Hill to shop?
No,
or Staples?
we went the other direction, 8 miles to Mountain Ranch, and there was a grocery store. We could get food there, but it was too expensive. And so once or twice a year, Dad would get the team harnessed up and drive to Valley Springs, which was 40 miles, and bring back a whole wagon load of food and supplies for the blacksmith shop, because he opened up a blacksmith shop there.
Right there at the home place?
Yeah.
Did he build that cabin?
Yeah, he hewed the logs and built the whole thing, a big barn. And
What was it, a 1 room or 2 rooms, or how big was it?
two big rooms down below and a couple small rooms up in the attic.
I've been there, but it's a long time ago, and I think that all that was left was a foundation.
Yeah.
When we were there, when you took us up there.
Yeah.
And I really don't remember now how large it was.
It was, the living room was 16 by 20 feet.
So that's a good sized room. That's as big as this room.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And then the other room was just a little bit smaller. It was probably 12 by 20.
Was that a bedroom or a kitchen?
It was a bedroom.
And
The kitchen was one corner of it was a kitchen living room combination.
uh-huh.
The other one handled 2 beds very nicely. Then we had upstairs with 2 rooms, 2 small rooms up there.
So then he built a barn and started a blacksmith business right there?
Yeah.
Well, where did he find the gold?
Well, he didn't find gold. That was the
Well,
point.
he was prospecting though.
Well, there was a mining claim on the place that when he filed on it, it was right square in the middle of 4 lots, in 40 acres of the 160 acres. It ran over part of a corner of each of the 40s. And mining claims could only be 20 acres, single claims. And so it kind of straddled her in there, and nobody was doing anything with it. And so we proceeded to, didn't pay attention to it, but subsequently, much later, I was in, working for the Davy Company in Florida when a neighbor, Mexican fellow, propositioned Dad he'd like to prospect for gold on another section of the place. He says, I think there's gold up on the west side. So Dad said, all right, go ahead. Anything you find, you can have half of it. And so he found enough colors and enough quartz to make an indication of the possibility of mineral in larger quantities. And so he got a hold of a mining, well, he was, I don't know what you would call him. He was stressed the attitude of opening up new mines and then get people to put money into it and develop. He was a developer, mine developer, I guess you'd call it. And so he got a hold of some money and from people who put money into it, and they put down a shaft on the hill, and the ledge was 8 foot wide and 3/4 of a mile long, quartz ledge, slanted down into the with a southern angle, and down they went. And they built a mill and brought up the quartz. It had a little gold in, and they crushed it and cyanided the ore to get the gold out of it. And they built a bunkhouse and a cookhouse and the blacksmith shop and all these other things there, and put this thing down a shaft that was more than 8 feet one way and 12 feet the other way, square, rectangular, and with a big winch and motors and everything up above there. Lower them down there and fill the buckets up and dump them out there, and then they'd crush it up in a big mill and crush it in a ball mill.
Well, that was a pretty big operation, wasn't it?
Oh yeah, they spent a lot of money.
Well, now, was that your dad's money, or was that a bunch of investors?
These were investors. In the meantime, before they started that, they paid Dad $1,000, and $1,000 went to this guy, this Mexican. And it was called the Tate mine. Well, they got down there 400 feet deep in that thing, that hole, and the quartz by that time was only 4 inches thick. It was only 4 inches wide, and that was all there was anymore.
Yeah.
And very little gold in that little 4 inches.
Well, how did he get his hand shot off?
Huh?
How did he get his hand shot off?
Well, that's in the other story that's in the one that's already written.
Oh. That comes later.
Huh?
That comes
That's in
later.
the next book.
That's in the next chapter.
Yeah, well, that's in the situation that's been written about.
Wasn't it over a gold mine, though?
Huh?
Wasn't it over a gold mine? Wasn't he defending a gold mine?
No.
Oh my God, I've been lying all these years.
What happened to her door?
Oh, Pearl went in the other
Oh.
room.
Anyway, it was that same one that was straddling all 4 things.
Yeah.
Was what it was all about. But
Weren't you just a little boy when that happened, though?
that was 9.
Yeah, because you said this all happened, this big thing, this big mining operation happened when you were with the Davy Company.
Yeah, I was with the Davy Company down in Florida.
So you were an adult then and long gone.
So that was the.
Want to stop for a minute? Oh, let's see. We're on.
On like Flynn.
You're on. Yeah. So where were we when we quit?
Oh,
I think we had just done the gold mine.
We had coffee and an apple apiece, and so as a
Right.
consequence, we feel well-rounded.
Right.
I'm rounded anyway.
But I think when you quit talking, you had just talked about Grandpa's gold mine and how it petered out, how they got down to the...
Yeah, they got down to where the 8 foot had dwindled in the lens to a 4-inch width.
Yeah.
And that the whole thing was about 3/4 of a mile long. It had been mined on previously for a while. I don't know, and we don't know how deep they went because the hole had been sloughed in. But anyhow, there had been a hole dug on the other end, 3/4 of a mile away. So that was the end of that one. There was another episode on mining, which was drastic in the fact that we'd been there 3 years, which made it from 1910 till 1913. And Dad heard somebody chopping trees up on the hill. He said to Mom, he says, I'm going up and see who's chopping trees. He says, I think I'll take my rifle along and see if there's some rabbits up there somewhere, and we need some dog food. So he strolled away. And after about 3/4 of an hour, why, there was rifle shots up on the mountain. And some yelling, and that was it. Half an hour later, Dad come in, no rifle, his face dripping blood, his hand dangling. And come to find out, those 3 fellows up there, one was chopping trees and 2 of them were standing behind pine trees. And one of them saw Dad and he says, throw up your hands, you son of a bitch, and started shooting.
Now, was that near the gold mine?
This was the mine, the square piece right in the middle.
Yeah.
They had no, they said this was our mine. But that was later. They started talking about it. So the horses were a bit frisky, and Mom couldn't harness them very well, and so Dad told me to go up to the neighbors, which was a mile away, the Swanettes. He was the mail carrier, and he came home on weekends, and this was a Sunday, I believe. And so I was to go up there and get Mr. Swanette, tell him to come down and drive Dad to the hospital in San Andres, 18 miles away. And he did. And the doctor there, his face had had a 30-30 bullet go through the left side of his face, just clipping the bottom of his ear and tearing the face quite badly, soft nose bullet. The other fellow shot practically instantaneously with the other one and shot his hand so badly that it had to be taken off at the wrist because there wasn't enough blood stream or tissue to go ahead and rebuild it as a, his doctor said he tried to save a thumb or a little finger, but he said it just didn't work. And Mr. Swanette brought Mom home, and for two weeks, why, we waited for Dad to come to be brought home. In the meantime, while at the hospital, he thought, well, I got a living to make, and I'm a blacksmith, and this is my right hand, which is usually my hammer hand and writing hand. He says, I can't grab a hammer, but if I have a leather sleeve with a bolt in it, and I bore a hole in every one of my hammer handles, he's like, put the hammer on the bolt, and I can still hammer like hell and hang on to the iron with the other hand, with the left hand. So by the time he got home, he had it all doped out what he was going to do, and then proceeded to also make another leather sleeve that had a big hook on it. he took a pitchfork and took a big tine out of it and bent it into a hook and bored holes in the square end and bolted it to the leather shaft and a with a leather band around above his elbow, and he could pull more with that than a man with two hands.
Huh.
And so from there on, why, he operated as a one-man blacksmith and shod horses and built wagons, helped work on automobiles when they finally come in.
Well, I've heard, and I don't know whether I heard it from you or Grandma, that he was a better blacksmith once he lost his hand than he had been before. And I don't know why she said that, but I'm sure Grandma Tate said that. Maybe just her pride.
Well, it could be that he would take pride in his work, I know that.
Mm-hmm.
And so there could have been a factor there, but his face healed up with a pretty good, it just sewed up and healed. So he wore a beard for, the next 3-4 years there. Kept it trim, and it looked quite, it hid the scar, and the only problem was that the shot had loosened his teeth, and his teeth were awfully sore to start with. No muscle, so he drank soup for weeks there till he could really start chewing a little bit. And
Did he lose any of his teeth?
no, his teeth settled back in and went all right, so no problem that way. Anyhow, before he came down off the mountain, he had the shots knocked him down, and when he come to, he still had his rifle in his left hand, and because the guy said, throw up your hands, and so he said, guess I better put his right hand up. That's when he got the reason he got the right hand shot off. And he said he heard them talking over there, and he looked over, and the old man was there. He looked over where Dad was, and he said, why, the son of a bitch is trying to shoot. He said, got his rifle right there. Dad thought, well, maybe it's a good idea. So he flipped the switch on the Savage rifle and swung it up at him and pulled. Well, the result was that the gun had gone off when he fell, and with his left hand he wiggled his shell into the chamber and moved it around and was going to pull it on his belly, and about that time he thought of a friend of his that had been shot with a pistol in his stomach, and he said he died the most horrible death you could ever imagine. He says, well, if he shoots me again right away, he says, I can't shoot him there. But he had his arm up, getting ready to shoot again, so he says, just wiggled his arm, wiggled around there and shot him in the arm. He said he saw the rifle go up and down, and he says, now the other one will get me. But everybody ran then.
So he didn't kill a man?
Huh?
He did not kill anyone?
No, he just merely shot him in the arm, for years. He wouldn't go to the hospital to have it tended right, so pieces of bone kept coming out year after year.
Well, did that ever go to trial?
No. Dad went to the district attorney and said he'd been held up, and the district attorney said, look, he says, those men are noted for lying. He says, one will lie and the other two will swear to it. He says, you haven't anybody that saw or heard anything that would do you any good. He says, my suggestion is you get a peace bond issued. And he says, we can do it. And he says, if they do anything at all, he says, you call us, and he said, the sheriff will be after them. And so that was what Dad did. So they were under peace bond from there on, indefinitely. Never come back. that they kept telling around that they were had been wanting to file on that claim, and Dad run them off, and was all this kind of stuff, but didn't make any difference. And so it wasn't segregated from the farm when Dad signed patented the farm, and Dad was hoping that he would get Woodrow Wilson's signature on the patent, but as it turned out, why, he missed it by a year or such a matter, and as a consequence he got, who was next one, Taft?
I don't know. Why, was he an admirer of Wilson's?
Huh?
Was he an admirer of Wilson's?
Yeah, thought Wilson was good president. So, he quit blacksmithing when he was 50. That is, he quit horseshoeing when he was 50. And he continued to blacksmith for the next 10 years, and then by that time he got things kind of squared away and started selling things. In the meantime, we had the World War I come up. 1917, we got into it. And the price of food all went up, the price of clothing. And the neighbor next to us come down and said, he says, "You've got a boy here," he said, "has graduated from grammar school, hasn't he?" He says, "Yep." So I said, "See, would he work?" Dad says, "Yeah, sure he'll work." I was the boy. I was just graduated from grammar school, 14. He says, "Well," he said, "the thing that I would like to do," he said, "Angora mohair is selling like crazy," and he said, "I can buy goats, but he says, I need somebody to take care of them." He says, "If you folks will take care of them," he says, "I'll buy them and we'll help shear them, and we'll split whatever profit, whatever we can sell the mohair for." So we went into the mohair business, Angora goats. Started in with about 100 and a dog. Always come with each batch of goats came with a dog. At one time we had 9 dogs there.
900 goats?
Oh, sometimes it was only 40, 50 goats. We ended up with 1,000 goats, and that he owned. And the next year we had kids enough to make it over 2,000.
Oh my God.
And I was busy. I would wear a pair of shoes out in just 1 month's time, even having resold it somewhere along in the 2-week period.
Now, was that completely your responsibility?
Yeah. And came along kidding time, which was long about March. The trick is, in sheep or goats, either one, is to get about a tablespoonful of the mother's milk into the animal, the babies, and they will go ahead and develop perfectly after that. If they get hungry and don't get that tablespoonful of milk in the first couple hours after they're born, they usually are puny or die off. And so my job was to make sure that each one got a sip of milk when it was born, and from there on, well, we lost very few of them, and we raised a lot of twins. And that's the reason we come up with over 1,000 kids out of that batch of 1,000 ewes, or goats. Angora goats, which are does instead of nannies. And
Angoras or does?
hmm?
Angoras or does?
Well, the Angora goat, any goat is a doe goat and a buck.
Oh, I see. Uh-huh.
And they had the does, and we had enough bucks for the mating. There's no problem.
Uh-huh.
Although we
Are
bought,
they imported?
huh?
Are Angoras imported?
Yeah, they came
from
from
Spain?
the islands of Angora,
Oh.
or company over Europe originally. They're long hair, and the purebloods never shed their hair. They keep their hair year round.
Mm.
And so that's the reason you get long hair. We imported one buck from Texas. His mohair he was 3 years old, and his mohair was 4 feet long. And the way they kept it, they took and every so often they would wash it and wash him and then braid it and then tie the braids up on his back and then put a canvas sheath over that to keep him up, to keep from being torn out in the brush.
Yeah.
And goats are primarily brush eaters. They eat a little grass, but they would much rather have a tree to nibble on.
Was that a good area for grazing for them?
We had nothing but browse practically.
Yeah.
It was perfect. And anyhow, the mohair sold for $1.25 a pound, and we had pounds and pounds of it.
Now,
and
did you shear them?
Huh?
Did you shear
Yeah.
them?
I could shear a goat in 5 minutes. Had a mechanical.
Yeah, it was
And-
not an electric shear.
No, it was just a mechanical. And the kid hair was $1.75 a pound. In other words, if the kids had been early enough, but by the time September came, they had mohair that was 6 inches long, and we sheared them then, and that brought, as I say, almost $2 a pound. But anyhow, it was very good, and we made money, and we got rid of all the dogs. We kept one. We kept one dog out of all the 9 dogs we had, plus our own one dog, and which was an Australian Shepherd, one of the blue ones. But he had brown eyes. He didn't have the blue eyes like a lot of the Australian Shepherds do have. And things were going good, except the Germans quit. As a consequence, the war was over.
Oh.
And the price of goats went from $25 a piece to $3.
Oh.
Here we are with 2,000 goats there. 1,000 of them belonging to the other fellow, and over 700 of them belonged to us. And so he sold some of his, and finally gave most of them away. So we started butchering. And they were pets to me.
Oh, that would be hard to do.
But I would butcher 10 to 15 a week. And the neighbor dad made contact with all the neighbors down the road for 10 miles in all directions, and would furnish a half a goat or a quarter of a goat, front quarter or hind quarter, whichever they wanted, for $1 a quarter. If you took a hind quarter this week, next year you had to take a front. That way you divided it up with everybody, getting good meat.
Mm-hmm.
And they are delicious eating. And so I'd butcher, on certain days I'd butcher, and I could, as I say, I could butcher 10 to 15 goats a day, and quite readily.
Now, you said a week. Do
Yeah.
you mean a day?
No, we do it all in one day.
Oh, I see. Mm-hmm.
But, and we finally got them down to where we only had a dozen goats. We'd taken quite a beating, but, and about a month and a half or 2 months after we'd gotten rid of 90% of the goats, why, Dad says, "Don't you want some more schooling?" I said, "Well, thought about it a little bit, but not too excited about it." Well, he says, "I suggested." He said, "Where'd you like to go to school?" I said, "Oh, I would like to go to Stockton." I said, "I want to become an engineer." I spent part of the time after the goats were gone working for a county engineer, laying out a chunk of road along near where we were there. I kind of liked working with the engineer. I'd like to become an engineer, civil engineer. So he took me down to Stockton. I looked at ads in the paper, and I bought a bicycle, $15, and used one. Hunted up a place to live. Started high school at night,
How old were you?
17,
Mm-hmm.
and daytime, I'm looking for a job. Well, first job I got was grease monkey for Cadillacs. And Cadillacs had 95 places to grease the Cadillac. And I had to grease every one in every place had to be greased, and I greased them. It was just you lay it on the ground and just slide around under it and pump grease into it. Well, after a little while of that, I messed around. I didn't like it. I found another place where I could wash cars, and so I washed all kinds of cars for a garage. That was better. It was summertime, perfectly good job. I had to clean out the car, take the seats out, and clean them out. One day I took a seat out, a rare seat, back of the seat, I found a wad of bills. It had $35 in it. So I went to the boss and I says, I've found a roll of bills in here. Fine. He took them. Never offered me any, didn't say anything more, and that was the last of it. Well, I thought, the heck with you, I quit. I'd washed enough cars. I got a job in a planing mill. I was the tail-off man. Shove a board in and planer, and when it come through on the end, I had to pull it on out and stack it up, or put it back to the operator on the other end, whichever they were doing. That was fun. I liked that. Only thing was, it got along toward winter, and the fog came in, and it was cold. And I come down with a cold, and the cold went into pneumonia. The landlady where I was staying, she says, I have a doctor who lives next door. He says, we use him right along, and he's an awful nice man. Shall I call him? I says, yep. He come over and he says, put your hat on. He says, you're going to the hospital. I had pneumonia in both lungs.
Oh. That's always been a problem. That pneumonia has always been a problem for you.
So in the hospital I went, St. Joseph's Hospital.
In Stockton.
Huh?
In Stockton.
Mm-hmm, in Stockton. And I stayed there 5 weeks before I was declared fit to leave again. Meantime, my first night I was there, the old sister come in, popped down on her knees alongside me. She said, and have you said your prayer? And I said, no, ma'am. She said, Ave Maria. Well, she says, are you Catholic? I said, no. The Ave Maria was all she got out. She popped up, and away she went. So that was my introduction to Catholicism. And well, the doctor said I could, after the 5 weeks, I could go. In the meantime, a young fellow I had met, he said, he came up to see me 2 or 3 times while I was in the hospital. And he says, Mom says I can have you come home with us and spend a couple of days before you go up to the mountains home if you want. And I said, gee, that would be wonderful. They only lived a couple miles away from the hospital. So they came and got me, took me home. Middle of the night, I felt all throat just plugged up, and I thought, something wrong here. I headed for the bathroom and tried to spit it out, and there was nothing but blood. I was just bleeding like crazy. So I called them. They called the doctor. He come, took one look at me, and headed back to the hospital. He says, you're out too soon. He says, you busted a lung. So I stayed in the hospital for 2 weeks more. In the meantime, here come Mom down, because they'd notified them that I was down again. Then I finally got better and went home. The doctor said, now it'll be 2 years before you want to come back down to this low country. after the first year, why, I was doing fine. And a friend of mine wrote from down Lodi, which is 14 miles north of Stockton, and he says, come on down and stay with us a while. He said, if you want to work a little bit, he says, you can. If you don't want it, it's all right. He said, the fruit is ripening. He says, the plums are ripe, the peaches are following. And he said, it's easy work. He says, you work as much as you want, or you do as little as you want. Talked to Dad about it. He said, well, if you want to try it. So I went down, started picking fruit. And picked fruit till there no more fruit to pick. The grapes hadn't come in yet. They were still due another month before they ripened. And a lot of the fellows were going to work that I was working around. Why, they were going into the canneries because the tomato season was in. Everybody was canning tomatoes. So I went over. I asked if they had a job for. Yep. They put me toting empty cans to the girls so they could fill them with tomatoes. So I toted empty cans to all the girls. And a couple of girls, a kid with me. He said, we're going to have a party on Saturday night. Don't you want to come? I said, sure. They had already graduated from high school. The fellows were going to, some that I was working with, were going to be seniors in high school. And they were laughing how they were going to beat Stockton in football that coming year and that fall and all the rest of it. And before we got through it, I was helping them load cars with grapes to be sent to East. And they said, well, next week we go to school. We got to start practicing football. I said, well, maybe I'm missing something. So I went over to the high school and talked to the principal. I said, I have a little money, but I said, I won't have enough to go a year, but I said, I'd kind of like to enroll. He said, we'd be glad to have you. He said, don't worry about money. He says, we always have jobs for young fellows. He said, I'm sure that you'd have plenty of work to do. I enrolled, started going to school. Took 5 subjects. Sailed along perfectly good. But I had to do some work, so I got a job with a family, a German family, which is a lot of them around Lodi. They a lot of regular German community there. It was just to be clean up around the house, outside. But the next thing you know, the cleaning up included painting the outside of the house 2 stories up. And after a month of that, I still had more to do. He wanted to work on the garage, which was a 2-story building. It used to be a barn. He wanted that painted. I told him I thought I had business elsewhere. So I quit. Went back to school and got a job to start with, and they were having trouble getting somebody to mop the cafeteria. They had a big cafeteria and a dining room. They said, do you want to mop? They said, it'll be $5 a week and you're on 1 big meal a day, noontime. Yep. So I mopped.
I bet you did. Every day, huh?
Yep. Didn't take long, but it was indoors.
Mm-hmm.
Cold. It gets cold at Lodi. Lodi it frosts and then the fog comes in.
Cold and damp. Yeah.
It's cold and damp. Indoors that way is fine.
Well, did you finish high school there at Lodi then?
Yeah. So I went back 4 years, but I discovered they had openings in their orchestra and band, and I knew how to read music from my fiddle development.
I was going to ask you where you learned to play the violin.
There on the farm.
Did you? Did your mother teach you?
No, I had an old woman that came in while I was trying to put the hair in my bow. After making the violin, I had to make a bow, and so I got the hair off of a neighbor's horse and washed it all up. And I was trying to get it in nice and even, and she said, "Go get a bar of Fell's naphtha soap." I did. She says, "Now we're going to do it this way." So I had one end in, and we proceeded to run that hair along on the wet soap, and every hair laid just as straight as a hair could lay straight. I got it at the other end and fastened it into the bow, and when the glue was dry, why, we washed it all out, put some rosin on it, and she started playing Yankee Doodle. She says, "That's all there is to it."
Well, how did you make the violin?
I made it.
I know, but you don't just made it. You must have had some direction.
Sears Roebuck catalog. I could see a violin in Sears Roebuck catalog. They would sell a lot of them. And the first one I made a beautiful neck with a scroll on it, and the pegs I made them they were all made out of maple, and the rest of it was made out of sides were made out of sugar pine, and the top and bottom were made out of pine of some kind. I don't know. Anyhow, we sent the Sears Roebuck, got strings, and Mom said, "Get a bridge too." So we indulged. I had a button bridge as well as the strings.
How did it sound?
Huh?
How did it sound?
Well, I got the G and the D and the A string up to tune with the organ, and I started tightening the E string,
Uh-oh.
and which is way up there.
Yeah.
But I got it almost. I think I had it up to C below E, upper E, and then she collapsed. The whole thing
Oh,
it
dear.
just went whoosh. And
Pine
so
was not the material to make a violin out of.
that was a little weak for
Yeah.
violin. So I tore it all apart. I discovered that Dad had the top to a antique sewing machine, which was nothing but a box with one side out. And they proceeded, when they put the sewing machine away, they just put this box over the top of the sewing machine, and that was it. And he didn't have the sewing machine, it was just the box he had there, but it was made of sugar, of walnut. That top, I looked at it, and it was a good heavy inch thick. I thought, well, if I just split that, I have two pieces, and that'll make a top and a bottom. So I split that, sawed it, split it down the full size of the box, and carved out the bottom, and I carved out the top. Made the back end next to your chin out of maple. Made the sides out of sugar pine this time, but they fit into grooves, and put the peg in under there and glued her all up, and that one I tuned up, and it went to clear up and stayed there. Actually, when I got to where I could have a violin to look at, I had made it the size of a viola.
Is that right?
And so it was a little oversized, but it would still go up to the violin tune. So I brought her down to school, and they put me into the fourth row of the third
Section.
group of violins. There was some 40 violins. There was first and second and third, and I was in the third. Played third fiddle.
How old were you when you made the violin?
Oh, I started that when I was 12.
Was that the beginning of your carving days?
Far as wood's concerned, yeah,
That was your first carving.
yeah.
Hmm.
The first sculpture I did was when we got there, and Dad was building the house, and he had found a spot down near the garden which had some beautiful red clay in it. And he says, when we get the house to the point we want to chink up between the logs, he says, that's where I'm going to get the clay to do it with, because there was no sand in it. It was just clay. And so Alice would say, let's go make mud pies. Well, she'd make mud pies, and I would make cats and dogs and calves and animals. I'd bring them into the house and give them to Mother. And what she'd say, yes, nice. She said, stick them up in the window. They were small. And for years, those darn things teetered around there because I made them in my hand, and the bottom were round.
Oh, for heaven's sakes. I think we're going to have
Hello,
to
it's
stop.
me, Robert Eisenberg, coal maker. How you doing?
Just fine?
Good.
Oh,
Just
stop
wanted
it.
to come by and let you know I was in the neighborhood.
Oh, okay.
Called about the news.
Here we go. Now, you were talking about being in the fourth row of the third section.
Yeah, but before I got detoured into sculpture,
Yeah.
if you'll remember. And I'm going to follow that just for a second here.
Okay.
That these little figures that I created back there in when I was 7 years old, why 8 years combination. Anyhow, they were in the family there for years, just rocking around on their round bottoms in the windows or up on the shelf. That was where I got started. When I got to grammar school, I looked at all the dictionaries to see the sculptures that were illustrated in the dictionaries of the Greeks and Romans, and every one of them just fascinated me. I wanted to do some of them. So I never got around to them for quite a while. But anyhow, that was the way that happened. There's more later.
Whatever happened to those little ones you did when you were 7 years old? Do you have any idea?
No, they probably burned up when the house burned up.
Probably.
They were properly baked.
Properly cremated.
Yeah. But the instructor we had in school for the violin, or for the orchestra, she said, you need some training. She says, aren't you interested? I said, yeah, very much so. Well, she said, I like to ride horses, and I have a beautiful little mare, and she said, and I would like to have someone take care of it. She says, I will swap you and trade you for violin lessons if you'll take care of my mare. So I took care of her mare for a year and had years violin lessons twice a week, as well as in the orchestra.
Oh, for heaven's sake.
So I learned to play the fiddle.
You
Not
played quite
but-
well, too. Well, I think you played quite well from my young vantage point when you used to play the violin for us.
Thank you. Anyway, that was the way my education went as far as that. And they had the boys that I'd worked with became super duper football players, and they played clear up to the point they were to be in the semifinals for the state championship, which was going to be in Stockton. And they were needing one more tuba player. I, having also practiced on the organ for Mother, in spite of the fact I didn't like it, I had learned to read the bass clef. And so I proceeded to learn to the tuba. So oompa, oompa. I got to go to the football game in San Francisco, no less, with the big bass horn around my shoulder.
That I can't imagine. The violin, yes, but the tuba, no.
Both ends of the spectrum.
Yeah, really.
So that was high school. And before I got through with high school, though, I have one more episode, and that is in the second year. I went into mechanical drafting. And it went as easy as a whistle, but also I was next door to the art department, and the art teacher discovered that I could sketch quite well. I went to work in the art department for fun. And the second and third year, I was the head of the art creative aspect, and the fourth year, I was in charge of all of the work for the annual. And so therefore, I was into the back toward sculpture. No sculpture there, but I was working toward it.
Well, it was a good basis in linear drawing, though. A good basis in linear
Yeah,
drawing.
it was a good. It was all of it was good.
And it was all pointing in one direction, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
This is the key to it. Which way were we going now?
Well, you had mentioned before we get any further into your life that you wanted to catch us up on what happened with the Lily part of the family from Miles Standish.
Oh yes, this is getting back there.
Now we'll jump back 11 generations.
That's the only way to go.
Yeah.
Go way back. You're gonna.
Yeah.
The famous Miles Standish asked his friend to propose to Priscilla for him, because Miles was, in spite of being a soldier, was very shy and didn't want to propose to Priscilla to be his wife. And so when when his friend went to Priscilla and asked about her going to become Miles Standish's wife, she says, "Why don't you speak for yourself, John?" So I missed the proposition of having Priscilla in my heritage, but I got Miles Standish. 11
Oh, it was John
generations.
Alden. John Alden was the shy one.
Huh?
John Alden was the shy one, and he
Yeah.
asked Miles Standish to propose.
No. Miles Standish was the one that wanted it, and he didn't get Priscilla.
I'm confused. Okay.
No, I know what I'm talking about.
All
I've
right.
been there.
Okay.
That was a former incarnation.
Well, so was I, Dad. Really.
But anyway, and my grandmother was a Lily, and
Well, now, where did the Lilies come from? Out of the Standish
the
clan?
Lilies married Standish. The Lily men married Standish women about 5 generations back.
Yeah.
And as a consequence, we still have genes of Miles Standish in our carcass, but the name Lily got into it. And my grandfather, when he married Grandma Lily, she carried that phase of it into the Newbold name.
Would you like a glass of water?
I'll get it
Now,
one.
Grandpa Newbold's family were English and moved over to Ireland, and because the England was having problems with labor and money, and so they went over there because they would be able to have ground to grow things on. And so they lived in a little cabin cottage that had dirt floor, thatch roof, and several children. I don't know how many children Grandpa Newbold grew up with. But anyhow, by the time he was 17, they had managed to scrape together $25.
I'm sure.
And that $25 bought passage from Ireland to America for him. He had to carry all his own food that he would have on this sailing ship, his take his own blankets and his clothes, and he came to America.
What do you suppose he thought America would do for him that he couldn't do in Ireland?
Hmm?
What do you suppose that he thought that America, what he could do in America that he could not do in Ireland?
Because there was work and money in America.
There already that was becoming the land of the golden dollar.
Oh yeah, America was the open door, and a great many to get it. It took the family years there to get $25 together so that one child could get away from Ireland. And now whether he sent for any more of them, I don't know. But I do know that he went to work in New Jersey in a truck gardening place and worked there 2 years. And then the weather being so damp and cold in the winter time was giving him trouble. I don't know what was, probably pneumonia or anyhow. He proceeded to come the next fall. He went took the train and got off in Iowa. He just barely got across the Mississippi River and to Cedar Rapids, and went to work there. And there he developed a farm, bought it, married Grandma Newbold, Rosetta Newbold, Rosetta Lilly, and
Okay.
they had 5 children. 3,
So the Lilies became Newbolds then.
yeah, and 3 boys and 2 girls. The eldest one was a boy. He didn't go to college, but the 2 younger boys went to college and became physicians, doctors. And the 2 girls, the oldest girl became a teacher, and the youngest one was my mother, Alice Newbold.
So there, as I recall, my thoughts about the Newbold family was that they were more into the professions, doctors, lawyers, type of thing.
Well, these two were anyway.
Yeah, That
The-
was kind of the standard that
Yeah,
they aspired to.
The third one became a what do you call it? He built farm equipment there in Iowa as a youth, and then went west. And when the gold strike hit the Yukon, he went up to Alaska and over the Skagway Mountain there, the White Mountain, and proceeded to work up there for 2 or 3 years, building mining equipment and setting up mills to mine for miners. And he did very well. He made quite a lot of money and came back to Seattle and bought a little place there and lived there for quite a while. Went back up once and he said the place was no good, so he came back and just continued to live in Seattle.
So we've had an Alaskan in our history that's been, we've had an Alaskan in our family history before Jan. I
Yeah.
thought maybe she was the first one to venture up there.
Now, Uncle Frank was
Was that Uncle Frank?
yeah, that was Uncle Frank.
Now, did you have much contact with him?
Yeah,
Did you?
he came down and visited us once up in the mountains there.
But the Newbolds, the doctors, I don't
One-
remember their names, but they
the-
settled in
Yeah,
the San Francisco area, didn't they?
Dr. Edwin Newbold settled in Oroville above Sacramento. He was physician there, and the Dr. Reuben Newbold settled in Morgan Hill,
That's
south
the-
of San Jose,
Yeah.
and they both married, but Edwin didn't have any children, but Reuben had, I think it's 6 girls, his wife had, and 1 boy. And his name was Teddy. Now, I'm not sure whether it was actually Edwin or not, because the nickname of Edwin Newbold in Oroville was Teddy. So I'm not sure whether it was cut
Yeah.
one way or the other, but that was the,
So that's where your Edwin comes from.
Huh?
That's where your Edwin comes from.
yeah.
Where does Lee come from, do you know?
Yeah, my uncle, my dad's brother, the youngest Tate out of Alabama. You see, now that the Alabama situation was a long situation there, because my grandfather, my dad's father, was one of the sons of one of the of 5 brothers that came from Scotland, and they were leaving Scotland because of the time of the woolen mills became mechanical in England. The owners of the land ousted all the people that lived on their land. These lords and earls and dukes and so on got rid of all the people that lived on their land, because they wanted the land just for sheep.
Yeah.
And so these 5 brothers came to America and landed in Savannah, Georgia. But on their way over, they got in a squabble as to how they were going to spell their name, because they had not had any schooling. And as a consequence, out of the 5 of them, 3 of it spelled the name T-A-I-T, and the other 2 spelled it T-A-T-E. So I come on the leg that comes from the A-T-E proposition.
Yeah. So have we just about covered the history now?
I think so.
I think we have. I can't think of any other questions. Now I realize how Grandpa Tate, your father, got out here to the West Coast,
Yeah.
and how he met Grandma, who was a Newbold, and then how they got him up into the mother lode, and then you migrated back down to Lodi to finish school. So that's a pretty good rounding out of what your history was.
Yep. Now from there on, why, it was a one-way ticket toward art. I was going to be a sculptor. My mind was thoroughly big, and so the California School of Fine Arts, in my mind, was going to teach me how to sculpture. So I went and enrolled. I shouldn't have. I should have gone and talked, but I didn't. I always go do something and then do a talking afterward, because the California School of Fine Arts had been associated that year with the University of California, and the University of California insisted that they have 3 years of art study, and then they could take a year to start on a year of sculpture. Well, I had already enrolled, so I went to school, and I'm not sorry I did. but I learned a great deal. I had learned the life drawing and painting, watercolors, design, creativity, and one professor always had the aspect. He had the aspect of this and the aspect of that, but there was always an aspect in it. It was a universal word with him, and so we had the aspect learned anyway. And before I got through with that, I had to go to work as well as go to school. And the only job I could find was running on a elevator in a building that was catty-corner to the St. Francis Hotel there in San Francisco. But I'd have to run it on my time until I learned to operate it, because it was a high-speed manual operation. And so I'd go down there and practice running the elevator up and down in the evenings. One evening, the chief what is he? No, he's I guess he might call him the building manager. I think that was it. He managed hired the cleanup crew. And so when I was taking him up to a floor up there on the 9th floor or 14th floor or whatever it was, he said, "Don't you like to make $5 tonight?" And I said, "Sure would." But he says, "One of my men is on the crew to clean here." He said, "Hasn't showed up tonight." He says, "If you work tonight and that'll be $5. If you come back tomorrow and work another 4 hours," he says, "that'll be the same $5 if that's all you get. But if the mine comes to work, or if you don't come to work, that's all there is. It's just $5. Which can you come back in the morning?" And I said, "Yep." So I started to work. He got through. He said, "Can you come back tonight?" So we worked from 5 till 9 at night and 5 till 9 in the morning. And after 4 days, he says, "I haven't heard from that man." He says, "He hasn't come back." And he says, "If you want to work all the time," he says, you're hired. $100 a month. And $100 a month in 1927 was a lot of money, because the Depression has just started. All the other telephone operators on the elevators, they were all telling about how much the money they were making in the stock market. Everybody was, if you put $1 in 10 days, you'd have $10. They were all just, and yet the stock market crashed within just a few weeks after that. But
So you didn't really become an elevator operator. You went to work for this other guy.
yeah, I was working as a
Custodian, really, huh? Kind of a janitor.
Yeah, I was a custodian.
That was good wages, Dad. For $5 for 4 hours.
8 hours.
Oh, I thought you said 4 hours.
It was the first night was 4 hours.
Oh, okay.
He was in a jam.
Uh-huh.
But it was $100 a month for 8 hours a day. I think it was just 5 days a week,
Uh-huh.
because we didn't work Saturday or Sunday. But
Well, could you keep up with your studies and do that?
yeah, I got awful sleepy,
I bet you did.
because I lived on Telegraph Hill, within a half a block of where the Coit Memorial Tower is now. And I would run from there to where I worked in downtown Los Angeles. It could take me 20 minutes to run it.
Downtown San Francisco.
In San Francisco.
Yeah.
And so I'd work till 9 o'clock, then I'd get on the streetcar and ride back out there, and it took 15 minutes to get out there on the streetcar. Then still had about 8 blocks to get up to where the house was. for our apartment I'd gotten. And this went along till then sometime in the spring, during the time, before the spring got there, I discovered this. I had one floor to take care of regularly, and all the doctors' offices on this whole building was doctors and dentists. Mine were all doctors on the floor I was on, and lots of tile, and so everything had to be washed and scoured, and as well as the vacuuming of the waiting rooms and all the rest of it. But he had good libraries, and so I would get through work and I would proceed and browse through the various books on diseases and odd people, and then I'd get into the magazines, and so the National Geographic was there, and in the front part of the National Geographic was an advertisement for the Davy Tree Surgery Company. They would train young men to become tree surgeons and put them to work. Good pay. So that was sort of running around the back of my head. And I was still going to school, doing all right, getting good grades. Still wanting to sculpture, but not able to. But I did the things that they required and enjoyed the work and the association with these students. And one morning the doctor came in early, one Dr. Best. He says, "Tate, what the hell is the matter with you?" I says, "Nothing." Well, he says, "You're getting thin as a rail. Come in here." He went over me and he says, "Now look," he said, "either go to school or work." He says, "Don't try to do both." He says, "You can do just one or the other of them," but he says, "You're wearing yourself out." He said, "You need to be outdoors somewhere." He says, "Get yourself a job outdoors." So I started looking at the National Geographic again and got the address of the Davy Tree Company in Kent, Ohio, and I wrote to them I would become a tree surgeon. What do they need? So they wrote back and said if I'd send them $75, that was the down payment for tuition that would be returned to me if I was employed and had started to work. That 75 would be automatically given back to me. And if meantime I was to study certain books that they would send me after I'd sent the money. So I sent the money, sent them $75, and I got back some books and I studied them, and then I had to take some tests and sent them in. They told me I could come anytime up till August 15th. That would be the last. So I aimed at August 15th. And so I quit my job, went up to Lodi, visited around there, and went up home.
Did you hate to leave school? Did you hate to leave school?
No.
You're probably getting so worn down that you didn't hate to leave any of it.
No, I wasn't doing what I wanted to do.
Yeah.
I'd gotten a lot out of it.
Mm-hmm.
But anyhow, I bought a 1924 Chevrolet and 23 Chevrolet touring car. I tinkered it up. It seemed to be working pretty good. When I come out to Lodi, I went to see a friend there, and he says, "When you leaving?" I said, "Well, don't have to go get leave till August." This was long in June. He says, "The post office is looking for somebody to act as a substitute." So I went over to the post office and asked them what they wanted, what it was all about. And he said, "We need a man with an automobile to be a substitute for the rural delivery. Well, I said, what do you pay? And I don't know what it was. It was pretty good money. I said, okay, I'll work with you. So I went and delivered mail for the next month. Each week I went to a different route. Each different mailman. They had to learn a new route each week. And finally got all organized and the car was working all right. I took a couple extra tires and I started out for Ohio, right over the Sierra Nevadas, past Lake Tahoe and out across the desert. And I got about 75 miles east of Reno, and all of a sudden the clunk, she just goes clunkety clunkety clunk. And I thought, uh-oh, got a bearing out. I stopped off the edge of the road, got my tools out, got underneath, took the pan off, and one conrod was completely lost all its babbitt. It was just rattling around in there. What had happened was the oil pump was on the outside of the motor, and there was a belt ran from the fan belt ran over a pulley out there on the pump, and it pumped. But the pipes that came out of the engine, one came up to the inlet side of the pump, and the other one back into the engine to lubricate the bearings of the car. It had broken. Vibration. So it was easy enough. It was just right close to the pump, so I fixed that. I thought, now then, I got a bearing to make. I remembered the miners, when they wanted to make a bearing, they took the bacon rind. They scraped all the bacon off of it and just used the hard rind, and they shaped up and put 2 or 3 bearing pieces of that together and made a bearing. Well, that's what I did. I took bacon rind and I made a connecting rod bearing, hooked her up, started her up, she run pretty. So I thought, well, if I just ease along, I find a wrecking yard somewhere up along here. The next town I think was 65 miles away. Why, I went forward, because it was 75 miles back to Reno. So I went across the desert there, probably 15 miles an hour. She was sounding good when I finally found a wrecking yard, and I went in and asked them if they had an old Chevy that they were tearing apart. Oh, not some. I wanted a connecting rod. So I bought the whole connecting rod, put it in, and I went on to Kent, Ohio.
But the bacon rod lasted for 65
That bacon
miles.
rind was just, I think it would have gone all the way to Ohio.
Isn't that amazing?
Of course, I didn't punish it. It was,
Yeah.
but I put her in tight. But that they used it around the mines for bearings on things that had to turn. So I went to work for the Navy Company. I could climb trees, loved the job, learned how to handle the work that was to be done, with one exception. They had a telephone pole about 1.5 feet in diameter. It wasn't quite that much. It was fully 16 inches in diameter in the yard, and everybody was supposed to be able to climb 20 feet up on that pole. Well, I'd get up about 6 feet, and then I would jump up and down on that thing and couldn't shinny any higher. That was as far as I ever got up with that pole, 6 feet off the ground. That thing was slick as from the climbing of men for years, and it was just as slick as though it had been. In fact, it had been greased at one time. One time, the kids had put axle grease on it from top to bottom, and for the next crew to come into. And got out in the woods one day, and the foreman of our crew, he said, "Tate, there's your tree." He picked out a little white oak there. probably a foot in diameter, and it was straight up, went up about 25 feet, not a branch on it. He says, "That's your tree." I went over there and I shinned it to the top of that. No problem at all. It wasn't greased. So then I went to, was sent to a little town about 20 miles from Kent there, went to work, stayed there a week, then I got a telegram going to Rochester, New York. In Rochester, we worked there for 6 weeks, part of the time on Thomas Edison's place, his summer place there. And here was a man walking around there, and I had swore it was Thomas Edison. And I asked the guy, I said, one of the boss, and I said, "Is that Thomas Edison?" He says, "No." He says, "He just looks like him." He said, "He's just the caretaker." But he was a dead ringer for the pictures we'd see around for Thomas Edison. And from there I was sent to Baltimore.
Well, okay, now I have a couple of questions. You mentioned Thomas Edison. You came into the electrical part of our society when you were a young man, didn't you?
Into which?
Electric.
Yeah.
What did you think of electricity?
Well, I'd been introduced to it, you see, with the automobile. The automobile came up there, and we had, in fact, we had electricity in the house where the Dad built.
You did? Oh,
Yeah.
that's a surprise. I didn't think you would have.
Yeah, see, he built in 1901 and 2. Because we just moved into the house when no, it must have been later than that,
Yeah.
because we moved into the house from,
You weren't born in 1901.
I was born in 1904.
Yeah.
And
1911.
I was 2 years old when we moved into the house, so I must have been,
Oh, the
so
house.
it was 1906. The earthquake was in 1906. We had electricity.
So electricity wasn't something that was new to you then. You
No,
kind
it
of grew
wasn't
up with it.
It was being used.
Uh-huh.
And one of the interesting things, as I saw it later, was that there was a bathroom in the house, but the toilet was on the back porch.
Oh, really? Was that because of the cesspool?
No, it was a city sewer, but nevertheless, the proposition, they were used to having a back house.
Yeah.
This was one step closer. It was on the back porch.
They never had gotten around to putting the toilet in the bathroom.
Oh no, you didn't have the toilet in the house.
You took a bath in the bathroom.
Yeah, that was for a bath.
Yeah.
But that hit me later as one of the steps of progress.
Yeah. That the toilet went into the bathroom. The toilet went into the bathroom.
Yeah. That was much later.
When did you meet Paul?
Meet what?
Paul. Paul Leonard.
Oh, well, that was a year later. From
You didn't go through the Davy school with him, huh?
no. A quick aspect from Baltimore, we were sent to Georgia into Florida. Part of the crew went on down to Miami. I stayed in the northern part of Florida, cleared lines all winter long there. In the early spring, along in March, it went over to Biloxi, Mississippi, Gulfport, then over into New Orleans, spent a month there, and then up through the capital of Mississippi, and to Kent again. From Kent right into Michigan, where I went to Hillsdale, met Adelaide. From Adelaide, I went to Jackson. From Hillsdale to Jackson, and I could 15 miles, and I could commute with a bus to come back to see Adelaide on weekend. The next one was from Jackson I went to Lansing, which was 125 miles, and no buses. So we started writing then. And from there I was sent to just north of Detroit to Huron. And there I met Paul Leonard. He was my boss.
Oh, I didn't know that.
And we worked there, and just the two of us. Then we were sent on up to Bad Axe, Bay City to Sheboygan. And in Sheboygan, we went to work on the place out on Mullet Lake, which is a small lake, not too far from Lake Huron or Lake Michigan, either one. But anyhow, it's shallow, and the water was warm and quite lovely. And he was up one big oak tree, and I was up another one. And we'd already pruned them, and we were doing a cavity job at each one, holes that needed to be filled up with cement. I had the first accident in my oak tree there that I'd ever had in tree surgery, beginning or later. I slipped, and my left arm came down on one of my chisels, and it just sliced it from almost to the bone. Then it started bleeding like crazy, and I told Paul, I says, I'm going down and go over to the house and see if they can do anything for this. I says, I've cut my arm. And I says, I know our little Red Cross unit we've got here, and our Band-Aids isn't going to help any. So I went over and rang the bell. A great big blonde gal came to the door. She said, oh my goodness, come on in. I says, not until we get something here to catch this blood. And I was standing out on the lawn, and it was dripping like crazy. So she come with a towel, and we wrapped it up, went in the house in the bathroom, and proceeded to wash and tied it up, put tape right directly over and pulled it together, and then binded it up. It just barely dripped a little bit, didn't do bad. We did a pretty good job of it. So we got out the door, and she said, I wish you hadn't gotten you injured. She said, I was going to suggest that we have a swimming party this afternoon when you got through work. She said, water's so nice. And I said, I'd sure like to. She said, do you suppose your boyfriend would go if we get another girl? And I said, well, I'll find out quick enough. So I stepped the door and yelled up to Paul. I said, say, we'll go swimming this afternoon if we have another gal to go with us? Sure. That was where Pearl got in the picture. She was the other girl. And
she was about 16 then, wasn't she?
She just graduated, or had one more year in high school. Though she was had just graduated, so she was past 16. She must be past 17. Anyhow, that was where Pearl got in the picture.
And Paul fell head over heels in love with her?
Now, you never knew.
Well, I'm assuming he married the lady.
Well, he was one of those individuals that didn't express his feelings out loud. The funny part was, we went along and finished the job, and when we worked there until almost the middle of September. One day he said, will you go to California with me if I can go? I said, sure. He said, okay. So when we get through with this job, he says, we'll take our stuff that belongs to the Navy people down to Kent and turn it in. And he says, we'll go down home. And he says, we'll go get loaded up and we'll go to California.
Why did he want to go to California?
Don't ask me.
Maybe because you had talked.
Swimming.
It seems to me that Paul said that he wanted to go to California, so you were going to take all your stuff down to Davie or drop it off and head west.
Right.
So,
We We did. We went. Meantime, before we got ready to go west, the girls didn't have to work on the next night. They suggested we go and have a barbecue and weenie roast. So we took them out, but on the where the Lake Huron and Lake Michigan come together, and a bunch of pine trees, and built fires, and toasted wieners and marshmallows, and they got dark, but it didn't stay dark because the aurora borealis flashed the most beautiful, clear up overhead even. It was that high,
Huh.
in all colors of the rainbow, and just one big exhibition after another. Later I discovered that they say the sunspots are the cause of it, and apparently we'd had a lot of super duper sunspots because the aurora borealis was the most beautiful I've ever seen.
What a treat.
Huh?
What a treat.
Yeah, it was a real treat. But the we didn't say goodbye to the gals, and we left and started west. We got to the Black Hills of South Dakota, went to see the four presidents being carved,
In
and
Rushmore.
Mount Rushmore, correct, and the buffalo on out over the plains there. We got to going down the road about 50 miles west of Rushmore, headed toward Yellowstone, but we weren't sure of it because there wasn't a sign anywhere, and just dirt, gravel road, and that was what we were kicking up a good dust, and the not a house in sight for some 50, 60 miles. All the way back here, we finally see a house up ahead and a barn off maybe a half mile off the road. So when we got to the road that went up there, we went up there. And there seemed to be people disappearing. We got up there, and a woman come out, and we asked her how far it was, if this road would go to Yellowstone. She said, yes. How far? Oh, she said, I don't know, quite a ways. So we thanked her, started to leave. Here a fellow come out from the barn, and where there was in the barn there was a beef hanging there that was just half skinned, and the man would come out, had a rifle in his hand. I said, Paul, it's time to leave. We went back and got on the road. I think they were, the house, the place looked like it was empty, and I think they were just there using it to skin out a beef that they'd gotten somewhere else.
They'd rustled.
It sounded that way. So we went to Yellowstone, and we played there for 4 or 5 days. We could go camp anywhere we wanted to, didn't make any difference. And we visited all the mud springs and the big geysers, and finally we went up to the ice fields, rode the caterpillars out onto the ice fields up there in Canada, went to the big hotel there to look it over from the outside, and then we went on to Seattle. And in Seattle we saw Uncle Frank, and he showed us Seattle and the stacks of frozen salmon and halibut in the warehouses there. Tons and tons and tons of it. And so that was our trip west.
So,
anyhow, we took down through Oregon, got into California, started down the Redwood Highway, and there, as we get out of Eureka, headed south, why the trees are fairly close to the road, but going from a distance, they look like they're right in the road, and they're tall, and Paul had the top laid back on our old Model T Ford, and he'd drive along, and as the closer he got, his neck would stretch back, and he'd be looking up. And after about the third tree that that we come to was like that. He said, Jesus Christ, those are tall sons of bitches.
That's enough. It's cute. He had never seen anything like that ever, huh?